The house has grown old around me. Its walls are swollen with damp. Its corridors echo with the faint groan of wood surrendering to time. The air tastes of rust and wet linen. I have lived long enough to forget most things, yet this place remembers for me. Every room, every faded portrait, every creaking stair carries a whisper of the years I've tried to bury. I was not born into the name they gave me, nor into the bloodline that claimed me. I was found, small, half-starved, and without memory, by the side of a road that bled into the swamps of Louisiana. The sky was low that day, the earth black with recent rain, and somewhere far away a bell was tolling, though there was no church for miles. They said I was 6 years old. They said I was lucky. But luck does not feel like being handed to strangers who have just buried their son. The governor, Mr. Beaumont, was a man of stature and sorrow. His wife had not spoken since the fever took their boy. She wandered the house like a pale echo, clutching the air as though afraid to let it vanish. When they brought me to her, she studied me with the trembling eyes of someone seeing a ghost. "Samuel," she whispered, and I understood then that I was no longer myself. From that moment on, I lived another child's life. His room became mine. His clothes, his toys, even his portrait above the nursery mantel, all mine, yet never truly mine. The servants avoided me. They muttered prayers when I passed, and one, an old woman named Margot, crossed herself every time our eyes met. She told me once in a low voice, "The land remembers what's been taken, even if the living try to forget." I didn't understand her then. I do now. Mrs. Beaumont began to call me by the lost boy's name more freely, each time with less hesitation. Her voice softened, her hands steadied, and she began to live again, or at least to pretend she could. At night, she would sit at the edge of my bed and tell me stories of things I had never done, of birthdays I never had, of lullabies I did not know. I nodded through them all, afraid that if I spoke, she might hear the wrong voice. The governor, however, changed in a different way. He began to watch me, not with affection, but with suspicion, as though something inside him knew what had been exchanged. His sermons at the chapel grew bitter. His prayers, when he thought no one could hear, were not to God, but to someone else, someone he begged to stay buried. The house itself grew restless. Rain never seemed to stop. It pressed against the windows like a living thing. The nursery door, though locked each night, was often found open by morning. Once I found footprints of mud leading from the hallway to my bed, though the servants swore no one had entered. The governor said it was nonsense, but I remember the look in his eyes. Fear, not disbelief. Years passed, slow and gray. I learned to speak like Samuel, to smile like him, to carry his posture and his habits. Mrs. Beaumont called me her light again. The governor stopped attending church altogether, and still, through every rain-soaked night, I could hear the faint tolling of a bell from somewhere behind the chapel hill. It was never loud, only steady, like a heartbeat buried in the earth. When I turned 8, the governor took me to see the grave. It lay behind St. Etienne's chapel, beneath a weeping willow whose roots had begun to pull at the stones. The inscription read, "Samuel Beaumont, 1857 to 1863. The governor stood beside me for a long while, then said quietly, "You must understand, son, names are only vessels. What matters is who carries them." He placed his hand on my shoulder, heavy and cold. "You will carry his name now. You will not fail." That night I dreamed of the grave, but it was open, and the rain poured inside like a voice. When I awoke, my window was open too, and the floor beside my bed was wet. I said nothing. In time, I forgot the sound of my own name. It slipped away like a leaf downriver. I lived as the governor's son, studied, spoke, and prayed as he wished. But sometimes, in the stillest hours, when the house was asleep, I would hear something beneath the rain. Not the bell, something slower, a sound that did not echo, did not fade, a hollow rhythm, patient and wet. It took me years to understand it. It was not the sound of water. It was the sound of someone knocking from beneath the earth. And now, even after all these years, I can still hear it, faint but certain, waiting for me to speak the truth. Because what we buried in that yard was not the governor's son, and the child who came back to his house that summer was never meant to live. And it was then I realized the knocking had never truly stopped. After that night, nothing in the house was ever still again. The walls began to moan under their own age, the windows sweated even when the air was cold, and the governor took to walking the halls long after midnight. His cane tapped in a slow rhythm that seemed to echo the knocking I heard in my dreams. He told me he was watching over the estate, but I think he was watching over the ground itself, afraid that something beneath it might remember him. I was 12 when I first noticed how the air inside the manor carried a different scent than the air beyond its gates. Outside, the world smelled of rain, swamp lilies, and gunpowder ghosts of the old war. Inside, everything reeked faintly of camphor and decay. Mrs. Beaumont had taken to keeping her windows shut, afraid of the night air. "It invites sickness," she said, though I knew she meant something else. The governor's study was the one room forbidden to all, yet I often saw light under its door at impossible hours. I could hear him muttering to himself, and sometimes another voice answered, quiet, almost childlike. "Ike, once when I pressed my ear to the wood, I heard him say, 'You should not have come back.' Then the floorboards creaked beneath me, and the light went out." The next morning, he was at breakfast, pale and polite, as if nothing had happened. His eyes met mine across the table. "You were awake last night," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, and he smiled without warmth. "Then you understand what silence costs." From that day, I was not allowed beyond the chapel yard. The governor said it was for my safety, that the town was dangerous. But I think he feared what the townsfolk might see when they looked too closely at me. Still, the servants whispered. They said the governor had visited the grave every night for a week before I was brought there, carrying a shovel and a lantern. They said the coffin had been closed again, but not by any priest. Mrs. Beaumont, meanwhile, was fading. She drifted through her days in a daze of opium and prayer, clutching a small silver cross that once belonged to the real Samuel. She began to call me my angel, then my mistake. Sometimes both, within the same breath. She would beg me to sing the hymns her son used to love, her hands gripping mine until they shook. I sang, though I didn't know the words. I think she knew that too, because she would stop me halfway through, her eyes full of tears. "That isn't his voice," she'd whisper. "Why can't I hear his voice?" Margot, the old cook, was the only one who dared speak plainly. "They stole your name from the river," she told me once. "The water never forgets what it gives. That's why it rains so much here." When I asked her what she meant, she spat on the floor and said, "Ask your father why the coffin weighed so little." I wanted to. God knows I wanted to. But the governor had changed. His hand shook when he poured his drink. His sermon stopped entirely, and the portraits in the drawing room were turned toward the wall, as if even the painted eyes could no longer bear to see him. Once I caught him kneeling in the hallway, his forehead pressed to the floorboards, whispering the same name again and again. Samuel. One afternoon, I went to the chapel when I knew he was away. The sky was gray, the kind that bruises the horizon before rain. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with candle smoke. I found the parish ledger hidden beneath the altar cloth. The ink was faded, but one line glared like a wound. June 16th, 1863. Burial denied. Body withheld by order of House Beaumont. Denied. Not performed. Not completed. Denied. When I stepped outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. They struck the stone path with a rhythm I knew too well, slow, hollow, deliberate. It was the same rhythm I'd heard under my bed all those years ago. I followed it step by step, until I reached the willow behind the chapel. The grave looked the same as it always had, though the ground beneath it had sunk deeper, as though something inside had shifted. The governor found me there. He didn't shout. He didn't move for a long while. Then he said, "You shouldn't stand over that name, boy. It doesn't belong to you." I told him I wanted to know who I was. He smiled, but his eyes filled with tears. "You're what was needed," he said, "and that is all you must ever be." That night I heard them arguing. Mrs. Beaumont screamed that she wanted to see the grave opened, that she wanted to know what had been buried there. The governor's voice rose like thunder. "You will not undo God's mercy," he roared. Then came a sound like breaking glass, and the house went still. In the morning, she was gone. The servant said she had gone to her sister's in New Orleans, but Margot shook her head. "No carriage came," she told me quietly. "The river took her back." After that, the governor stopped speaking altogether. He sat in his study for hours, staring into the fireplace. Sometimes he would whisper, "The river knows. The river always knows." I didn't understand then what he meant, but a week later, I awoke to find water dripping from the ceiling, though it hadn't rained in days. The drops were red, dark as old wine. They fell in a slow pattern onto the floorboards, forming a line that led straight to my bedroom door. And from somewhere below the house, that knocking began again, louder this time, closer. It kept going until dawn. And I realized, with a kind of trembling clarity, that whatever they had buried in the chapel yard was not staying buried anymore. The third night after the stains appeared on the ceiling, the governor called me to his study. The house was trembling with a storm that hadn't yet broken. Lightning crawled along the windows, and the smell of damp wood filled every corner. When I entered, he was sitting at his desk, surrounded by maps, ledgers, and a single candle that flickered as though struggling to breathe. "Close the door," he said. His voice was brittle, worn down to its last edge. I did as he asked. He pushed a small box across the desk toward me, an old wooden thing, the kind used to hold communion wafers. "What's inside," he said, "was never meant to be yours, but since everything else has become yours, it might as well be too." Inside was a lock of hair tied with black ribbon, and a small silver ring engraved with the initials S.B. He watched me stare at it. "He drowned," the governor said finally. "The river took him during the flood. I should have let the water keep him, but your mother, she couldn't bear it. She begged me to bring him back, and I didn't." I waited for him to go on. He didn't, so I asked, "What happened to me?" He looked at me then, really looked, as if he were seeing the answer and could not bear to speak it aloud. "You were left here," he said quietly. "A fever orphan, nameless. We gave you his name to quiet her grief, but when the coffin was opened to lay him inside, there was no body left to bury. Only mud, only river stones." He stood trembling and pressed his palm to the window pane. "The river doesn't return what it takes. It only lends it back. Changed." Before I could reply, thunder cracked through the air, shaking the glass. The candle went out, plunging us into darkness. From somewhere beneath the floorboards came a hollow sound. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. The governor froze. "He's awake again," he whispered. "He wants what was his." The next day, he ordered the servants to leave. Every one of them. Margot refused, saying she wouldn't abandon me, but he sent her away by force. The house grew silent, stripped of voices, filled only with the groaning of old wood and the endless hum of the storm outside. That night the knocking returned, not beneath the floor now, but from the walls themselves. I traced it to the study, where the governor had locked himself inside. I called his name. No answer. I pushed the door open. He was kneeling beside the fireplace, the floorboards torn up before him. Beneath them, a hollow cavity yawned open, the soil black and wet. In his hand was a lantern, flickering weakly, and in the pit below, something pale moved. Not alive, but not at rest either. He looked up at me, his eyes wild. "I tried to save you both," he said, "but the river doesn't forgive theft." Then he reached into the pit, and the thing inside reached back. When the storm broke over the roof, the lightning illuminated the room for a single second, long enough for me to see his face vanish into the mud, the lantern falling, the flame smothered by wet earth. I ran. I don't remember how long I fled, or how far. The rain followed me down to the riverbank. I looked back once, and in the glow of the storm I saw the manor's windows burning faintly from within, not with fire, but with a cold blue light, like the reflection of the river itself. They found me the next morning, barefoot and half-mad, muttering the same word again and again, Samuel. They buried what was left of the governor near the chapel, but no one ever opened the grave under the willow again. The water had already claimed it. Years later, when I was grown, I returned to the ruins of that house. The river had shifted course, swallowing most of the land. Only the chapel's spire remained, jutting from the water like a tooth. I walked to the edge, knelt, and whispered my name, the only one I had ever been given. The water rippled once, as if in answer, then stilled. And for the first time in my life, I understood what the governor had meant. The river never returns what it takes. It just waits for you to come back. 9 years passed before I dared set foot on that soil again. The war had ended. The plantations were gone, and the land where the Beaumont Manor once stood had turned into marshland. The locals called it the Drowned Parish. They said no crops grew there, no birds sang there, and the water smelled faintly of rust and lilies. I had become a drifter by then, a man who carried too many names and belonged to none of them. My hands bore the scars of river work, hauling rope and ferrying goods along the Mississippi. But every night, no matter how far I went, I heard the sound of slow knocking somewhere beneath the current. When I returned, it wasn't out of courage, it was out of sickness. My chest had begun to ache, and my lungs filled with water in my sleep. The doctor in Baton Rouge said it was the fever, but I knew better. The river had begun calling, back what it had lent. I found what was left of the Beaumont land hidden under a veil of fog. The grand iron gate had fallen into the mud, twisted and half-eaten by rust. The willow tree by the chapel still stood, but its branches dipped into the flooded earth like mourning arms. The chapel door was gone, its threshold sunken. Inside, there was silence, the kind that hums beneath the skin. The pews were rotted, the altar cracked, but the faint smell of candle wax lingered, as though some ritual had never ended. I walked to the corner where the parish ledger used to lie, but the table was gone. Only a stone slab remained, covered in moss. I knelt to clear it, and as I did, I saw the name carved there. Samuel Beaumont, 1852-1863. The letters were uneven, as though carved in haste, or by someone trying to remember how to spell. Rain began to fall again. The drops struck the stone with that same slow rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. The water gathered around my knees, rising inch by inch. And then I heard it. The voice, faint, childlike, coming from below. "Why did you take my name?" I froze. The water rippled, and the reflection that stared back at me wasn't mine. His eyes were pale, his hair darker than mine, his mouth moving through the water remained still. "You were never meant to stay," he said. "You were what she prayed for, not what she lost." The chapel trembled as the ground beneath it gave way. The stone floor cracked open, and black water surged upward, pulling me down to my waist. The voice rose with it, not one, but many now, whispering in unison. "Give it back." I tried to move, but my legs were caught. The water climbed to my chest, my throat, my mouth. And then, silence. When I awoke, I was lying on the riverbank. The chapel was gone. In its place stretched only a wide, still pool that reflected the dawn. My clothes were soaked, my hands caked with mud. In my pocket was the silver ring, SB, though I had thrown it into the water years ago. I never spoke of that night to anyone. I left Louisiana soon after, drifting north, changing names with each town I passed. But every mirror, every calm surface of water, every rain puddle, it showed me his face, not mine. And sometimes when I'm half asleep, I hear the river whisper my borrowed name. It sounds gentle now, almost forgiving, but I know it isn't mercy, it's memory. Because the dead don't forget the living, they wait until the living remember them. 3 years passed before I dared speak again of Louisiana, though even silence carries its own kind of confession. I had taken refuge in a small parish near the Kentucky border, under a name that wasn't mine, wearing the collar of a faith I no longer possessed. The bishop there was an aging man named Father Duval, blind in one eye, soft in speech, and always smelling faintly of laudanum and lavender oil. He took me in without questions, as though he recognized a wound familiar to his own. The church itself was old but untouched by war. Wooden beams blackened by smoke, a bell tower that leaned slightly west, and a rectory whose walls breathed with dampness. Each night I kept the lamps burning low, and listened to the faint creak of the wood, as if the house shifted in its sleep. I began keeping the parish ledger again. Baptisms, marriages, deaths. The living and the dead sharing the same page, their names fading alike in ink. One evening, while copying records by candlelight, I found a torn page, pressed between the back covers. It was older than the rest, written in a trembling hand. The entry bore a date I could not mistake, April 6th, 1863, and below it, adopted by decree of the governor, one orphan child, unnamed, to bear the title and estate of Samuel Beaumont. The candle flickered, the ink was faint, but the letters were mine. My hand had written those words. I remember it now. I had copied the decree years ago, back when I worked in the governor's office as a clerk. It was my hand that had sealed the lie into permanence. Father Duval entered the room then, his step soft against the wooden floor. He asked if I was well, and I told him I had found something strange in the records. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile one gives before a burial, and said, "We all find our names written somewhere we do not belong." Then he left me there with the candle and the page. That night, I could not sleep. I sat before the fire, watching it dwindle into ash. The page lay on the table beside me, the ink darkening as if it drank the light. I thought of the governor's wife, her pale hands, her endless grief, the way she had looked at me that day when I stood in the nursery. She had not looked at me then. She had looked through me, as though searching for something buried deeper than blood. It rained through the night, heavy against the shutters. In the morning, the parish bell refused to ring. The rope had frayed and split, as if from rot, though it had been sound the day before. When I climbed the tower to repair it, I found the bell rope tangled around a small object, a child's silver ring, still shining despite the rust. It bore the same initials. SBI dropped it, but it did not fall. It hung there, suspended in the wet air like a thought unfinished. For a long moment I stared, feeling the world bend under something unseen. When I returned to my room, the page from the ledger was gone. The book lay open where I'd left it, but in its place was a new entry, written in a handwriting that mimicked my own. Burial. One foundling, unknown, buried without record, interred in unmarked soil near the river, witnessed by none. There was no date, no parish seal, only the faint impression of a child's fingerprint pressed into the ink. I told no one. I burned the book that night, watching the letters curl into smoke. But I swear as the last page turned black, I heard the bell toll once, though its rope still lay severed. Since then, I've begun to forget the sound of my own name. When I sign parish documents, my hand trembles. I write the letters as though they belong to someone else, someone long dead, And yet, each time the ink dries, the paper seems to whisper back to me. The same 3 words, always the same. You are borrowed. I traveled north that winter, my health in decline, and my memory thinning like the paper I wrote upon. There was a small seminary near the Indiana border that took in broken men, priests who'd lost their calling, veterans who'd lost their faith, widowers who'd lost everything else. I arrived there under the name Father Elias Ward, and for a time, they believed me. The seminary sat upon a rise of frozen earth overlooking a marsh. Its walls were stone, dark and sweating even in the cold. The corridors smelled of iron and tallow. Every door groaned when opened, as though complaining of the years. The chapel inside was humble. A single stained window, its color leached away by time. Each night we gathered by lamplight to pray, our voices thin and uncertain, like echoes of men long buried. I was assigned to the confessor's room, a narrow chamber with a wooden screen separating penitent from priest. It was meant for the students, but few ever came. Those who did rarely spoke. Mostly, I sat there in silence, listening to the faint breath on the other side. Sometimes I imagined I could smell river water through the screen, damp, sweet, heavy with rot. One evening, near the turn of spring, a child's voice spoke from the other side. "Father," it whispered, "do names die when we do?" I felt the air leave my lungs. I asked who he was, but the voice only said, "The one you borrowed." The candle beside me dimmed, its flame bending toward the screen as though drawn by breath. I told myself it was memory, the fever again, some lingering dream that had. It followed me north. Yet when I looked down, there were drops of water on the floor, clear, fresh, and still moving, as though something unseen had climbed dripping from the marsh. Days passed, and the voice returned. Not every night, but enough to steal sleep from me. It asked about the river, about the woman who used to hum by candlelight, about the governor's study, and the ledger I'd burned. Every word carried the weight of something once alive. I stopped answering. Still, it spoke. By summer, the seminary had grown unbearable. The other priests noticed my pallor, my absences. Father Hanlon, a man of stern kindness, asked if I wished to confess. I told him the truth, or part of it, that I had stolen a name, a family, a life not meant for me. He smiled as if such sins were common among the living, and said softly, "You must learn to bury it." But I had already buried it, under river mud, beneath candle ash, inside every false name I'd worn since. That night I returned to the confessor's room. The air was colder than usual, heavy with stillness. I knelt, and on the other side of the screen I saw movement, faint, shifting, like a face pressed close to the wood. "You took my breath," it said. "Now breathe for me." The candle went out. For a moment I thought the world had ended. When I opened my eyes again, dawn was breaking through the window. The screen was empty, but the seat beyond was wet. The wood swollen and glistening, as though someone had sat there through the night, dripping river water. When the other priests came to find me, they said I had been whispering in my sleep, repeating a name over and over. I denied it, though the taste of river silt still clung to my tongue. I asked them to seal the confessor's room. They refused, so I did it myself, nailing the door shut and marking it with a cross made of soot. But some nights, even now, I hear knocking from behind it, faint and measured, as though someone still waits to be absolved. And I cannot decide which of us is meant to speak first. The years after Indiana were shapeless, a blur of travel and half-slept nights. My body grew thinner, my hair white as linen. I stopped wearing the collar, though the mark of it still lingered around my throat like a faded bruise. I took up lodging in a parish school in rural Ohio, a place forgotten even by its own parishioners. They called me Mr. Ward, and that suited me well enough. I was merely a caretaker now, tending to the chapel lamps, sweeping the hall, keeping the graves from drowning under moss. The building had once been a governor's retreat, long before it was gifted to the church. Its walls were lined with portraits, men and women of rigid bearing, pale hands folded, gazes fixed just past the viewer as if watching something unseen. The largest portrait hung in the rectory's main hall. It showed a family, a man in uniform, a woman in white lace, and between them a boy. His eyes were gray, his expression solemn, almost kind. I had seen that face before. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, the resemblance of memory to art. Yet each night when I passed through the hall, I found the portrait changed in some slight way. A shadow where none had been. The boy's gaze tilted a fraction lower, his mouth parted as if beginning to speak. I started avoiding the hall altogether, walking instead through the cold kitchen or the outer yard, where the wind at least felt honest. But the painting waited. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves, I found a ledger, the school's old registry. The earliest date listed was 1864, and beside it, a note in faded ink, dedicated in memory of Governor Beaumont's late family. My hands trembled. The ink was nearly gone, but the initials at the bottom were clear. E.W., my own forged name, written years before I had chosen it. That night thunder rolled across the fields. The children were asleep in the dormitories, and I walked the corridors alone. The lamps flickered as though struggling to hold their ground against the storm. When I reached the hall, I stopped before the portrait. The candlelight trembled across the paint, and for a moment I thought I saw moisture on the canvas, tiny beads of water glistening on the boy's cheek. I raised my hand. The air felt colder there, dense as if drawn from some deep place. And then I saw it. Beneath the varnish, the faint impression of another face, smaller, thinner, pressed into the paint beneath the boy's own. Two portraits, one buried under the other. I stepped back, and the floorboards creaked, slow, deliberate, as if echoing my guilt. The next morning I asked the rector about the painting. He said it had hung there since the building's consecration, that no one knew who had commissioned it, and that it had never been moved. "Why do you ask?" he said. "Has it begun to fade?" I told him yes, but fading was not the word. That night I returned once more, unable to resist the pull of that child's face. The storm had passed, leaving only the sound of dripping eaves. I stood before the portrait until my eyes blurred, and in that haze the figures seemed to waver. The governor, the wife, the boy, and behind them, faintly visible now, a fourth shape. A man standing in the shadow, his hands clasped, his head bowed. And though his features were dim, I recognized him. I was looking at myself. I tore the portrait down. The canvas ripped across the middle, the sound sharp as a cry. Beneath it was another layer, older still, the image of a graveyard half-flooded with a single name carved into a headstone nearly erased by water. Samuel Beaumont. I fell to my knees. The candle went out, and in that darkness I heard a soft voice. Not from behind, not from within, but from the paint itself. "You were supposed to remember." By morning, the portrait was gone, the wall bare, the nails rusted over as if untouched for years. The rector claimed no one had seen or moved it. He said, perhaps I dreamed it. But dreams do not leave stains where tears have fallen. And that night, when I washed my hands, the basin filled not with clear water, but with river silt, dark and heavy, as though the past itself had begun to rise. I reached Pennsylvania in late autumn, drawn there by a letter addressed to a name I no longer used. The handwriting was delicate, careful, the kind that trembles slightly at the ends of each stroke. It bore no return address, only the words, "You are remembered." The letter had come from a small town near the Allegheny Hills, where the fog lay thick over the ground like breath. There I found a house at the edge of an abandoned parish, a 2-story wooden structure, its roof sagging under the weight of years, its windows veiled in soot. No one had lived there for decades, the neighbors said, but when I opened the door, the air inside was warm, as if someone had been waiting. Dust coated everything, chairs, mirrors, a small writing desk in the corner, and there, upon the desk, lay a single object, a locket tarnished with age. Inside it was a miniature portrait of the governor's wife, her painted eyes soft and distant. Opposite her was a tiny lock of dark hair tied with silver thread. I knew then that this was her house, the house where she had come to die. In the back room stood a small cradle, half collapsed, filled with ashes. Not the clean gray of burned wood, but the heavy, black kind that clings to skin like guilt. I knelt before it, my heart thundering. Beneath the ash, I found fragments of paper. When pieced together, they formed a note written in a hand that seemed to falter between grief and confusion. Eshen. He was never mine to name. They told me the river would keep his secret, but rivers do not keep, they return. I sat there for hours, unable to breathe. The silence grew thick, pressing against my ears. Then, faintly, from the upper floor, I heard a sound. Soft footsteps, slow and deliberate. I rose, my hand against the wall for balance, and began to climb. Each step groaned under my weight, as if warning me back. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched into shadow. The wallpaper peeled like dead skin, and the air carried the scent of mold and rain. At the far end, a door stood open. Inside was a child's room, untouched, impossibly clean. Toys arranged neatly, a small bed made with white linen, and upon the pillow, a folded paper, brittle with age. It was a baptismal record. Samuel Beaumont, born May 2nd, 1863, baptized June 4th, same year. Godfather, Elias Ward. My hand shook. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. Beneath the record lay another paper, this one blank, save for a faint watermark in the center, the outline of a ring, pressed into the page, as if by something once wet and heavy. That night I did not sleep. I sat before the cradle staring into the ash, until dawn bled through the cracks in the wall. When I rose to leave, I found footprints leading out the door, small, bare, and still damp, as though someone had just walked through the river and into the house. I followed them into the yard, where they vanished in the frost. Only a single mark remained in the soil, round and deep, as though a hand had pressed down there and lingered. I left the house behind me, yet its smell followed, of ash, damp wood, and something faintly sweet, like lilies left too long in stagnant water. On the road out of town, I looked back once. Smoke was rising from the chimney, slow and gray, curling against the pale sky. I know what you will ask, if I believe she sent that letter, but I do not think the dead write with ink. They write with memory, and memory is far hardened, or to burn. By the time I reached Maryland, my body had begun to betray me. My breath came shallow, my sight dimmed at dusk, and my hands shook so violently I could no longer hold a pen steady. Yet still, I wrote. Each night I filled a few pages, though the words wandered like fevered thoughts. Perhaps I hoped that by writing I might bind memory to paper instead of to my soul. I rented a small room near the edge of a river town where barges moved through the mist like slow beasts. The innkeeper was a widow, kind but curious, and she asked once if I had family. I told her no, that I had outlived them all. She smiled sadly, as though she didn't quite believe it. The room smelled of damp linen and old tobacco. Its single window faced the river. Some nights I woke to see the current gleaming faintly in the moonlight, the surface rippling, though the air was still. And sometimes I swore I could make out the shape of a child standing at the water's edge, too pale, too still, watching the house. I tried to pray again, though prayer felt like talking to a locked door. My words no longer rose, they sank. The rosary beads slipped between my fingers like wet stones. I kept the silver ring, his ring, tied around my wrist with a piece of cord, a reminder, or perhaps a chain. I told myself I would throw it back into the river, but I never did. Each time I approached the shore, my hand froze. One morning, after a storm, the widow called me outside. A coffin had washed up near the docks, half buried in the mud. It was small, child-sized, its wood warped and split. Inside there was no body, only water and a handful of lilies gone brown with age. The lid bore a carving, barely legible beneath the rot. Samuel Beaumont. My knees gave way. I remember the widow's voice fading as she called for help, the river wind cutting through me like a blade. They said I fainted, that I was ill, with fever. But I know I didn't faint. I fell into the memory that has never let me go. I saw it again. That night in 1863, the storm raging, the governor's wife kneeling by the bed, her tears soaking the sheets. The dead boy beside her, pale as wax, and me, the clerk, the orphan, standing in the doorway, waiting for her to speak. She said the words as though they were a prayer. No one must know. You will take his name. I remember lifting the child, my arms trembling under his weight, carrying him out to the river while thunder split the sky. The water was rising fast, swallowing the reeds. I laid him there and whispered his name once, as if by saying it, I could set him free. But names bind deeper than blood. The river took him, and I took what he left behind. When I awoke in the inn that evening, the ring was gone. The cord around my wrist had snapped. My clothes were soaked through with river water, though it hadn't rained since dawn. The widow said she heard me talking in my sleep, whispering two voices at once. I tried to leave that night, but when I stepped outside, the river had overflowed its banks. The town was drowning in slow, silent water. Reflections moved across the surface, faces, shapes, shadows. In every window, in every pool, I saw the same boy, standing knee-deep, waiting. He didn't look angry, only patient. I went to the dock, where the coffin still lay. The lilies were gone. Inside was only a mirror of water, black and still. I saw my face in it, or what remained of it, older, thinner, hollow-eyed. But behind it, faint as mist, was another, theirs. The current stirred, the reflection rippled, and I understood what the river had been trying to say all these years. It was not calling me to remember. It was calling me to return. That night, I packed my few belongings, the ledger scraps, the locket, the last of my letters, and walked toward the shore. The air was cold, the moon veiled. Every step sank deeper into the mud, the world softening beneath me. When I reached the edge, the water shivered around my boots. I waited there for a long while, whispering the only prayer I still knew. Not for mercy, not for salvation, but for silence. The river listened, and then it began to rise. The manuscript you have just heard, these entries, these confessions, were found sealed inside the wall of a burned rectory on the southern edge of St. Mary's Parish, 5 years after the Great Flood of 1887. The building had long been abandoned, its roof collapsed, its altar blackened by smoke. Beneath the ash, a parish boy discovered a small iron box. Inside, one water-damaged ledger, its ink still legible in parts. The handwriting begins steady, then trembles into madness. Dates fade, names repeat where they shouldn't. The author signs each entry with a different hand. Samuel Beaumont, Father Beaumont, S.B. the clerk. And in the final passage, no name at all. The coroner who examined the remains beneath the rectory recorded one skeleton, though certain notes mentioned the bones of a child fused to its side. An error, they said, of heat and collapse. The case was quietly closed. The ledger was never entered into official record. Yet those who have handled it speak of a strange thing. When the pages are turned in silence, a faint watermark appears along the paper's edge, a parish seal that no one can identify. Some claim it moves, like ripples spreading through still water. Others insist that if you look long enough, you can see the shape of two figures, one kneeling, one standing behind, blurred as though seen through glass. For decades afterward, villages reported hearing the sound of pages fluttering at night from the riverbank, even when there was no wind. The water, they said, would rise without rain, and in its reflection a second moon would sometimes appear, dimmer, smaller, but closer to the ear. The inn where he stayed was torn down in 1890. Nothing remains but the foundation stones and a solitary willow tree that grows at the edge of what was once the road. Beneath that tree, the soil is always damp, even in the hottest summer. Travelers leave flowers there, not in remembrance, but in recognition. They say it feels wrong to pass without leaving something behind. Scholars of local history